Okay, thanks everyone for returning. This requires quite a bit of endurance to make it through this day. We have a really packed schedule, but I can tell you that we're almost at the end of the day. We're getting closer. There will be a lovely reception and opportunities to talk with everyone and to talk with all of our speakers. Now we're going to head into our second discussion session. This one is led by Vanessa Kam, who is head of a Beaux-Arts and Architecture Library here at Stanford, and she has assembled an exciting panel to talk about visual art and AI. Vanessa.
Thank you so much, Nicole, and thank you everyone for being here. A hearty welcome to you all. I'd like to start by introducing this amazing array of panelists that have assembled here with me. So we're going to talk about visual art and machine learning in a bunch of different contexts based on the backgrounds of the panelists. So to my left is Emanuele Lugli, who teaches and writes about late medieval and early modern art with a particular emphasis on Italian painting, trade, urban culture, and the history of fashion. His theoretical concerns include questions of scale and labor, the history of measurements and technology, conceptualizations of precision, vagueness, smallness, and the reach of intellectual networks. To his left is Kyle McDonald, who I'm hoping that you got to see his brief talk just before this. He's an artist working with code. He crafts interactive installations, sneaky interventions, playful websites, workshops, and toolkits for other artists working with code. And then finally, we have Kenric McDowell, who's worked at the intersection of culture and technology for over 20 years, and he co-leads the Artist plus Machine Intelligence program at Google, where he facilitates collaboration between artificial intelligence researchers, artists, and cultural institutions. So what I thought I would do is, first of all, I have questions for each of the panelists individually, just given that they come from different walks of life and perspectives. I couldn't find a question that I thought all of them would feel super comfortable answering. So I'd like to ask them these individual questions, then I invite them to ask each other questions in an organic kind of way, and then towards the very end, I'm really hoping to open it up to the audience to allow you to ask them questions. So the first question I have is for Emanuele. And so this question comes from the fact that I'm trained as an art historian, and when I went to art history school, I learned different ways to analyze works of art, and they included things like formal analysis, what's in a painting, right? Contours, shade, perspective, figurative art, abstract art, that kind of thing. But also things like, socio-political kinds of analysis of a work of art, putting it in a context, analyzing it there, seeing how an artist responded to what happened prior to their work, different movements, et cetera. And so what I'm finding, an observation that I have as far as how AI and machine learning has worked when you're looking at large data sets of visual images, it's a couple of things. One, it is isolating maybe certain objects or faces, and then it's doing sort of like groupings, classifications of similar things. And so to me, it's sort of mimicking most an art historical approach that we call iconography. So what is in a painting? What are the objects? What are the symbols? And so given that this is what's happened in the past, I'm wondering for Emanuele, who teaches Renaissance and early modern art, how he thinks that AI techniques could benefit his research in the art history side of the equation in terms of Renaissance art. Would an iconographical approach be enough for him as far as his interests, or is he hoping for something more from AI?
Thank you, Vanessa, for inviting me and for this question. So art history and AI have a complex relationship because if you take art history as the discipline that studies the meaning of artworks, then you end up with a discipline that has a multiplicity visions. So it doesn't have a unified goal. There are some art historians, as you say, that are interested in iconography, which is a very old practice. So they're interested in categorizing artworks. So they want to tell you who's basically being represented on a painting or in a sculpture. And that's pretty easy. That's pretty easy for AI to recognize who these characters may be or what kind of subject is being depicted. But then there's a reaction to this mode of doing art history, which is, we can call it the social art history, where they're trying to find the meaning of an artwork within the wider context. And that's where AI somehow would have to mine data from a multiplicity of fields, so understand the politics, the kind of the social issues at the time, in order to try to see what kind of role these paintings had. And that, for instance, where AI may be struggling at the moment. There have been multiple projects by numerous universities and research centers that relate art history and AI. And some of them have been somehow problematic because they basically, as a tool, AI just answers the questions that you're asking, right? And a lot of these projects are asking very, in my opinion, very dull questions. They're telling, basically they want AI just to confirm what we already know about art history. So they ask AI to categorize paintings according to style, but the very ways by which styles are categorized, are biased, they can be problematic, but if you input this kind of information, of course, they produce a timeline of art history, which is exactly what we have already. So this, for instance, is a project of Rutgers University. So I don't find these kind of projects very interesting. And then there are projects, for instance, one run by the Courtauld Institute in London, which is a construction of a database. They want to get rid of tagging, so they basically use AI as a way to categorize images according to subjects or to themes, so you can type in skeleton or lion, and all the paintings with lions and skeletons in them, they kind of come out, which is, it's very efficient, but this is somehow still answers questions about what kind of elements and subjects are present in art history. And then there are a series of projects, like, for instance, one that chaired by Elizabeth Honing at Berkeley, that are trying to ask questions about process. So, for instance, they're trying, in her specific case, she's digitizing something like 1,600 pictures by Bruegel and Rubens, and she's trying to use computers, thanks to a company based in France, and to find all these kind of little details that usually are overlooked, like mills in the background or like fugitive figures. And by mapping them, she's capable of recognizing patterns in the representation of the landscape, and usually things that kind of escape the trained eyes of art historians who are just looking for subjects and so on. She's putting together like an interesting database that is telling us who may have painted these figurines in the backgrounds and so on. And therefore, we can understand something more about workshops and workshop practices and so on. But this question, though, is an old question. We have been asking questions about, how workshops were organized for decades now. AI, though, is brilliant, like speeding up the process.
Great. Thank you. So moving on to the next question and panelists, we can always go back to Emanuele's points later on. So Kyle, my question for you has to do with some of the projects that I looked at on your website, and I'm super glad that you brought up People Keeper, because I didn't realize how tongue-in-cheek it was until you presented it. But anyways, so a project like People Keeper, which is about tracking and analyzing and auto-managing your relationships with a smartwatch, it kind of monitors your physical and emotional reaction to someone. It also takes sort of physiological metrics as to how you're relating to someone. Does this person make you angry or nervous or frustrated? Therefore, you can manage your time better in terms of who you want to spend time with. But also the one, Man and Woman in the Middle from 2017 with Lauren McCarthy, where you wrote scripts to intercept and modify or reply to text messages from each other in the hope of syncing your different communication styles and developing a better relationship and conversation. So I'm not sure if that was like tongue-in-cheek as well, but these two projects to me, I would interpret them as having to do with intimacy and human connection. And how AI can assist that or somehow lead to discoveries about how people connect and how people are intimate. So I'm just wondering if you could tell me if that was sort of your intention, and if it was, like, why you wanted to start looking at these questions and what you think AI can tell us about human connection and intimacy.
Wow, that's a great question. Thanks for asking. So these projects are led by Lauren McCarthy, who turns out is my partner. We've been married for 3 years now, and we actually met through working on an art project together. Our first art project, does anyone know what GitHub is? A bunch of people? Okay. So our first art project was actually a GitHub repository where we started keeping track of our relationship. Every time that we had an idea for a new direction we wanted the relationship to go, we'd start a branch. When there was an issue, we'd log an issue and we'd resolve it. If we really liked the direction the branch was going, we'd merge it with the master branch. Eventually, we had to make the repo private because it got into some kind of intimate details. So, but it was super helpful. And I mean, we were looking at it not as a kind of tongue-in-cheek thing, as that wasn't the only thing, right? It is a little tongue-in-cheek, we are critical of tech solutionist approach of like, yeah, just throw GitHub at it, or throw a smartwatch at it, or throw AI at it. We're critical of that, but that doesn't mean that we oppose it, right? It means that we want to be engaged in discourse with it. And for us, that means looking at these technologies in the context of our relationship and examining them through the way that they modify our own intimacy. So with man-woman in the middle, I send Lauren a lot of text messages that say, I'm going to be there in 15 minutes, and I'm always wrong. So the server, the script that I wrote, it just modifies it, and it says, I'm going to be there in 30 minutes every time. And it turns out like our relationship got way smoother once we, And we also, a funny thing about that project is we don't know what the other person's doing to the script. We don't see each of our sides of the server. So I also changed some of her messages, and she doesn't know. Like, I use a lot more emoji than she does, and it kind of weirded me out for a while when we started dating. So I just started throwing tons of emojis into her messages, and I felt like, she's really putting her heart into, and I could never remember whether it was something I did or something she did. And I think that's the thing that art and kind of examining these technologies in the context of relationships can do. It can open up space for exploration for what these technologies mean by, leaving some ambiguity, right? If you don't know where the technology was changing things, then you can kind of start to wonder, well, does it really matter? Like, what am I projecting onto this relationship? What am I projecting onto this person, onto this technology? You read it exactly. These are all projects that are designed to examine technology in the context of intimacy. I'll mention one more that I think you'll like. There's a project around the same time as People Keeper that we built called Us Plus, and it's kind of plug-in for Google Hangouts. So if you're having a video chat with someone, it'll start analyzing your facial expressions and every word that you say, and it will give you advice about how to have a better conversation with that person. So if you've been talking for like a minute and the other person hasn't said anything yet, it'll just mute you. Or if you're really saying like, I this, I that, and you're only talking about yourself, it'll say, maybe ask the other person some questions about how they're doing. Or if the other person's not smiling at all, then it'll say, try and cheer them up. So these kinds of modifications to our relationship, they're not just designed to criticize tech solutionist ideology, they're also designed for us to open up ambiguity in our relationship. So when we use that on our own conversations, and we get a suggestion like, maybe ask the other person some questions, it gives you a chance to kind of laugh and say, oh, haha, it told me to do this. But then you think, well, maybe I should. Let's see what happens.
Right.
So we're really interested in those ambiguous spaces.
Nice. I really like the mute option.
Yeah.
Wish I could use that regularly. Okay, so Kenric. I would love to talk with you about your work with the Artist plus Machine Intelligence program at Google. How long have you been working in that program?
The program launched officially in February of 2016 here in San Francisco at Gray Area with the Deep Dream event, which is the first neural network art event, I guess, in the history of art. It's actually probably not true. Santiago Cajal y Ramon probably exhibited some neural networks before we did in the early 20th century. But anyway, yeah, so that was in 2016. I had started working on it in 2015. Actually, Deep Dream was the catalyst for a lot of that. Deep Dream, for those of you who don't know, was a neural network that printed out images according to like how the machine saw them, and they were very surreal and strange, and it leaked online with this image called Trippy Squirrel, which is this kind of looked like a squirrel that was just like melting because you're on acid when you're looking at it. It was like that kind of vibe. And that leaked, and then the program began after that as a sort of, not particularly a response to that, but because that was out there, my director was like, hey, let's do an art program, and I was the only person with an MFA and 150-person tech research org, so I was like, let me help. And so then we launched that program in 2016, and so it's been running since then. We've gone through different iterations where we were working in really small scale ways. We've now are engaged with a lot of other groups at Google, like Google Arts and Culture, for our grant giving and for our collaboration. We have creative technologists that work on our team with the artists to realize their visions, their projects.
Great, okay. So it's only been about 3 years, but one thing from my understanding is that the Artist plus Machine Intelligence program takes proposals from artists who want to work with machine learning. And so I imagine by now, after 3 years, you've kind of seen a number of different types of proposals that have come through. And I'm just wondering about, first and foremost, I think, AI artists working with AI, it's really a collaboration. Obviously, AI doesn't go off on its own and create art. There's a human hand present. And so you've probably seen a variety of different types of collaborations through these proposals or just your exposure to artists working with it. And I'm wondering if you can try to sort of describe the types of collaboration that you've seen, whether it's things like, collaborations based on like imitating the human hand or kind of augmentation of what artists can do. So if you could sort of, describe the nature of collaborations that you've witnessed through the program, but also if there are any ones that you feel are particularly innovative that kind of like go outside the box of what you've seen as a norm in terms of collaboration.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't want to sort of like, I'm hesitant to sort of like reproduce a whole bunch of tropes about like what is AI art, because this is the thing that we're kind of constantly pushing against. But I will maybe focus a little bit on like what are some of the technologies and how do people kind of respond to them. One, like I was talking about Deep Dream, which was a generative system or a neural net that generated imagery. And these types of generative systems actually have quite historical artistic precedent, in the 20th century at least. But with neural nets, we can, take like generative adversarial networks and these other types of like recurrent neural networks and make them print out imagery or generate large amounts of imagery, large amounts of text. And often those are, they're always trained on a corpus of data. And so a lot of times what you'll see is a practice where an artist curates a corpus of data, whether it's a poetry and literature or images that they themselves have shot or from the public domain or that are appropriated in some way, and then train a neural net on those and generate those types of images like endlessly. And of course, in that case, like the meaning of the image is not in the individual image, it's in this flow of images that comes out of it. And I think the most interesting practices there are ones that really get into the process. There's a lot of these like GANs that you can take and download code and run it. But when you start to curate images and train, you start to understand more about like how these systems are made, one, and like where sort of bias comes in, and you can really investigate like what is the meaning of a training set, what does it mean to curate a corpus of data to generate from. So we're working with an artist named Anna Ridler in London, and she's done a piece which I curated into the Google I/O conference last year, which was made from tulips, and so she took tens of thousands of photographs of tulips herself, and then trained a GAN to generate these tulips. And so she had video screens that were, kind of growing these tulips, but the tulips were tied to the current price of Bitcoin. So there's obviously like a historical analogy with the tulip craze in Holland and all that kind of thing, but there is also a sort of like larger framework for looking at the intersection of these different systems, for her to really curate her own data set and like have her hands like really deep into that process. And we found, when artists do that, the things that come out look much more like their own. There's also within that project in particular sort of implicit, I'd say, institutional critique around technology and the systems and economics, and those, I think there's a really interesting convergence recently with institutional critique and media art and sort of that stuff all coming together, partly because the people that are able to create media art need a lot of institutional structure, but also because media technologies and digital technologies like AI are so prevalent in our daily lives that it's hard to use them without having some kind of critical take on them. And if you don't do that, then you're maybe assuming a lot. So that's one category, kind of generative. There's a lot of work that uses these generative systems as inspiration or in interplay with the hand. So Robbie Barrett's done some really interesting collaboration with a painter in France whose name I can't recall at the moment, but they did a series with skulls, and this guy's painting skulls all the time. So Robbie trained a neural net on the skulls, and they generated those, and they were kind of shown together. And so there's, I'd say the first kind of impulse for a lot of people when this stuff came out was like, oh, well, now we can make a robot that will make art and then we don't have to paint anymore, which is like, okay, well, I don't really know why you'd want to do that as a painter. But then I think the next reaction was kind of like, oh, well, we should collaborate. It shouldn't just be, that's just automating away something important, let's collaborate. And so the nuances of that collaboration are where a lot of this stuff comes in. And, I'd say, there's also been a trend more recently where really established media artists or artists that work like with architecture installation, like Pierre Huyghe, Hito Sterol, both had shows at the Serpentine in the last year that involved AI systems, and they're kind of trying to contextualize AI as one component of a larger contemporary art practice that folds in installation, architecture, sound, choreography, and just kind of that totally open space of contemporary art.
Great, thank you. I'd like to open it up to the panelists to ask each other questions.
Actually, I have a question for both of you, since you're both talking about process and how somehow AI is making you more aware, your artists, right? Aware. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what you were just saying, how, perhaps specific interventions where AI made you aware of something, like a blind spot, maybe, in the process, and that you found that there was some sort of creative outlet from it.
I'll share one. When I was in high school, there was this chatbot that I talked to on IRC. I don't know if anyone remembers IRC, but and I was really surprised by the quality of the conversation. I mean, by today's standards, it was terrible, but at the time, I was just really impressed. I thought, this isn't the kind of conversation I should be having with a computer, right? This is a conversation I should have with another person. And that was the first time, and it's happened a lot more since, where I've had this feeling like these creative systems, or maybe human imitating systems, can help us like de-center ourselves in some ways as creative people. I think when I saw that, I felt like, well, what's left for me to be human? If this computer is so good at having this conversation. And then recently, it's like, there's some great work on music composition from Ana Huang, who's also working with Google. When I heard her compositions from Music Transformer, I thought, wow, what's, not really, but kind of what's left for human musicians to make. And I think every time that I feel that space getting filled up of what I previously thought was just human, then I have to reevaluate what my role is, and understand better what it means to be creative as an artist. So that's kind of related to that process, but I think it's more about the reflection that these systems create in me.
Yeah, I agree that I've often compared AI to a mirror in terms of like what it shows us about ourselves and our projections that we project onto it. I think I would say I find that mirror well used when it's turned onto systems. So we did a project in 2017 with an artist named Ross Goodwin who creates AIs that write poetry, and we did a road trip with him going from New York to New Orleans. And he had a surveillance camera on the car that was taking snapshots every minute, and then an AI system, a machine learning system on his computer in the car that was spitting out poetic descriptions of what it saw. And what the project really revealed to me was, in terms of like the narration of these systems and the building up of a sort of sensory apparatus for a machine learning network, was how scarce really real information was, because we were using the Foursquare API, which if you're driving down this corridor from New York to New Orleans is going to basically tell you about freeway exits, fast food restaurants, stuff like that. And so when we like turned that input into poetry, it showed what information was available and what description of reality was available, and the sort of lens, I mean, to me it was a very dark story that it was telling, because we were driving down this kind of like disused industrial corridor, kind of like following in the veins of like the American road novel, and its kind of like masculine automotive like aspects with this kind of speed and overproduction of text, and like that it felt very intertwined with this kind of food desert that we were in, and this like systems that kind of perpetuate this type of information, this type of architectural presence in the landscape. So from, when an artist like that plugs all these systems in together, it becomes a chance to really like reflect on the infrastructure that we're in. So maybe it's less like a personal experience for me, but more of one of like a way that like using technology in a particular way, turning the lens in a different direction can actually produce a lot of criticality, whereas oftentimes the technologies as they come straight out of corporations are really uncritical of their context. And artists can be really good at revealing and surfacing these like these like structural concerns within the context of their art making. And having said that, this type of like perception of art is really based on like a contemporary idea, like a post-conceptual, post-performance contemporary idea of what art is, that you could be out there kind of like doing a road trip with computers and writing it all down, and this is like somehow almost like a performance that like is really different from the pre-modern art history. So it really relies on a different set of concerns about what art making is to find that reflection.
Yeah. And if I can add, you also have a completely different scale of data. I mean, like one of the biggest differences between the work of both of you and mine is that I'm always struggling against the limitations of the data I have. I mean, for artists like Vermeer, we don't even have 20 paintings, so it's very difficult to understand what may happen, and that's that's a kind of fixed problem for like all pre-modern artists. So actually, my other questions would be like, what do you think are the kind of blind spots or shortcomings you have to deal with? Because for me, it's mostly about the quantity of the data. It's limited, and sometimes, research centers, universities are spending a huge amount of time to digitize and, quantify the little data we have, and then somehow even that is not enough, right? To get a picture, but you've got endless pictures of tulips and so on. I mean,
I think one blind spot is, as a creative person, just accepting the research that's available as what's available. I mean, we have a few tools, like we can imitate things, we can check what the similarity is between few things, we can what else? There's not a lot available. And so I think it's important to take a step back and say, what questions do I want before I even look at what the research tools are that are available. And I think that's one reason that tomorrow the workshops are really helpful for people to dig into some of these techniques and understand Just because similarity looks like the only application of this, that doesn't mean it's the only application. Maybe there's other questions you can answer that you didn't think you could answer using these tools.
Exactly. I wanted to pick up on something that Kenric raised about criticism and institutional critique before I open it up to folks. So there's this artist based in Vienna, Hans Bernhard, has come up with an idea about the next Documenta, the really important international art exhibition that happens every 5 years in Kassel, Germany, and he suggested that an AI machine should oversee the event as, quote, humans have lost their perspective in light of the exploding art market flooded with thousands of artists and millions of works. So what do we think about the potential of AI to introduce some critique of the standard ecosystem of how the art world works with things like Documenta? What do we think the potential is for? Yeah.
I mean, to my mind, it really depends on who makes it, right? If there was a sort of Mondragon anarchist art collective that wanted to create an AI art evaluator and unleash it on Documenta, then that would be really super interesting, if they want Google to create it, I don't know if that's a good idea, but really the point of saying that is whenever there's an AI solution proposed for a problem, the question is whose AI and for whom. I like what you were saying about sort of Emanuele, about the reproduction of past knowledge. This is I think if you were going to approach that problem, the conventional answer would be okay, well, let's look at all the art, let's get pictures of it, let's rank it, how much it costs, put other data parameters in there, and then we'll put a piece of art in front of a camera, and it'll say, well, this thing is worth this much, so it should be included or not, But really, that's all based on a certain set of data and assumptions, and so, I think more AI with more different opinions and with more perspectives embedded in it is better for everyone. So I could see it being interesting if maybe they said, let's get 30 different AIs to curate Documenta, at the same time, by different groups. That would be interesting. But this is the problem is inside when people say, well, an AI did it. There's kind of this assumption that that's a thing. There's just an AI and it's good and it's smart and it belongs to who knows, So whose AI, and for whom.
So I think we have just maybe a few minutes for audience questions. Anyone have a question for any of the panelists?
So thank you so much for the discussion. I have a question that I don't know that I want you to answer as much as respond to. And again, forgive me, I'm not an art historian. I'm just a guy who likes art. Okay. Yeah, it's cool. So here's what I want to hear you respond to. A lot of times when we talk about AI, of course, we talk about the appropriate data, but we also AI, you should employ AI to solve a particular problem, a business problem, an institutional problem, whatever. It's a tool towards that end. Art, as sort of I experience it, is a thing to experience. It doesn't have necessarily a utilitarian end. It might be helpful and reflect on society. There's all kinds of comments on that. But I want to hear you respond to so AI is usually geared towards solving a problem. I don't feel like art necessarily exists to solve a problem, it just is. So can we comment on what problem AI solves in art, or what is it doing? And maybe we've already kind of answered that, but that's what I'd like to hear you respond to.
Well, maybe I can just start. In art history, there are some problems within the discipline. I agree with you that art is not necessarily there to solve problems, although art in many ages had utilitarian purposes, right? For instance, religious art, you use it to feel connected to divinity and so on. But there are some problems. For instance, we don't know how certain things were made. We don't know how many people worked on certain artworks. We don't know how long it took to make certain things. The classic question is about Leonardo's process. We still know so little about the techniques, basically. So AI can become very helpful for that. For instance, we know very little about the art market in the pre-modern world. So those kind of more or less specific questions, I think AI has got some real value. It can really speed up the process. The other questions, what is art? Art is it's 15 million different things according to how you look at it, what kind of period you're considering, and so on. So much that in a way, art history as a discipline is schizophrenic, because pre-modern art is very different than contemporary art and the market where we live right now, right?
I like to think of art in response to what you were saying about AI being used to solve a lot of problems. I like to think of art as being something that creates problems. And if you want more problems in your life, all you need to do is sit down and try and install TensorFlow. You'll have plenty of problems. So there's a lot of problems that AI creates for me in my work, and sometimes that's in looking at a data set in a new way, or asking why are these two things similar, or once I see that there's a tool that's available, then I can ask, well, what should I do with it? It's not necessarily creating an experience for me, but it can be part of an experience-making process, and it can give rise to the kind of questions that create those problems I'm interested in presenting, sharing.
Yeah, I mean, my experience of this kind of dichotomy between like problem solving and problem creation with art is that it's been really important for us to, well, art has been very important for opening up spaces for different kind of questions to be asked. Like, even you were talking about your plugin for Google Hangouts, and like if Google was like, hey, we're gonna make an app that like that mutes you like halfway through what you're trying to say, like nobody would want it. But when an artist does it, it comes from a really different place, and it comes from a place of like freedom and exploration. So this has been not that we're necessarily trying to instrumentalize the artists that we work with, but in terms of like how I can justify what we do to people that might not quite understand that making art for its own sake is a valid activity, we can say, well, like, look, there's this space of freedom where we can really explore things and do things that we can't do any other way, and think about things and bring up questions that really are not, that we would have no way to find our way to in a traditional design discipline or research discipline. So in that sense, the problem creating nature of art is really helpful to researchers. But again, like, I don't want to over-index on that, because that's not personally why I'm interested in it, but it is a nice benefit that allows places like Google to find resources for artists.
One more question?
Thanks. My question has to do with the juxtaposition of the morning and our conversations of the morning with this more recent conversation. And I feel like we spent a lot of time talking about what good data was and accurate data, and having people select things that were true or objectively real. And I'm wondering if you all have thoughts about training AI models to be subjective or to reflect subjective opinions, and then potentially compare them, compare the output, see what that does, and to get away from this idea that we have to make everything accurate, that we could play with the space of inaccurate data in meaningful ways.
And actually, I would add, great question, thank you. But historically speaking, the notions of sameness, identity, and repetition is very different than the one we have right now. I worked on the history of measurements for long periods of time, and what people consider as metrically accurate in even 100 years ago is very different from what we consider to be accurate. So, that helps us to problematize the very concept of repetition and, so on. So it's, I've not trained in a computer yet, but it's.
I guess maybe what I would say to that is the idea of questioning the validity of data, or even like measurement, really undermines a lot of the narratives that technology is promoting in general in culture. I think it's exciting to think about like what would it be like to make data sets that are subjective. I mean, I think that's what Anna was getting at, and what a lot of like the feminist AI projects are working on is like, what is it like to put an opinion into the data, or to like curate the data in such a way that it's not like trying to uphold some idea of like universal techno-scientific truth, right? Which like, or to create like non-situated knowledge. The idea of like embracing the situatedness of knowledge with these systems, I think, is the only way to actually make them useful or constrain the like implications of their use. So I think the idea of, especially for artists to do that, like they have the most ability to be absurd, to be playful, to like do things that don't make sense or that like are nonsensical, and people will sort of like put up with it because they're expecting that experience, and they're expecting to get something more out of that. They're waiting for like a higher level of order to emerge. So I think that's a really exciting proposition. But I guess to what I was just saying, there's a political angle to that question of like objectivity and desubjectified objective knowledge, that like it's upholding some ontology at some point. So, anytime there's a kind of transparent system like that, we have to be skeptical to some extent and say like, what knowledge is being hidden here? What point of view is being centered,
I'd hope some of these efforts towards democratizing AI could answer that question too, that, we need sort of truth or objectivity when we're all interacting with each other, like you said, in this kind of political sense, but maybe the more individual ownership we have, we can impart more subjectivity into the AI that we work with.
Great. Thank you so much for your questions, and thank you, panelists.
Thank you, Vanessa.